Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Sync Your Life podcast. I am so thrilled today to be joined by my friend, Amanda Callen. We actually met through social media thanks to her husband. Her husband and I actually went to high school together. And a couple of years ago, really, I think it was around the start of the pandemic, Amanda had reached out to me to be interviewed on her podcast, which we'll talk about, I'm sure. And it was a joy to just meet her and to connect over Zoom and to talk personal growth journey with her. She is a marriage and family therapist. She's also a mother and wife, an avid runner. And she's going to talk to us today about this concept of radical self-acceptance. And I think this is going to be a great conversation to have. I know that most of the people listening to this are women. So hearing about how we can accept ourselves in a loving way is something that I think all of us, including myself, need to hear. So Amanda, welcome to the podcast. If you could just give us a little bit of background about yourself, what brings you to marriage and family therapy, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, it's fun to be on here, Jenny, and good to see you. I am excited to do this interview too. I have lots of thoughts swirling, so I have a few notes here because I might have to rein it in. But a little background about me. Like Jenny said, I'm a wife, a mom of three, a former high school teacher for a year, and decided, no, not my thing. And then ended up going into school counseling, where I did probably my most favorite professional work was in the nonprofit sector, where I worked with a group that runs support groups for grieving children, ages 3 to 20, and their caregivers. Did that for a while, had our first child, had our second child, and then decided I want to be home. And so have been home for a while with kiddos now, and our third child is now in second grade. And so I started a program through Syracuse University to get my marriage and family therapy license, hoping to get back into the therapy world, just in a different capacity. So I'm right in the middle of that, getting ready to start internship, and I'm excited about what's coming this summer with that.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's interesting too, because her husband that we both know mutually, and that I went to high school with, is a sort of a serial entrepreneur. So I know that she kind of lives this life of not just being a mom and working on this therapy license and everything that you're doing, but you're also married to someone who's always on the go and always creating and thinking. And so awesome. Well, let's dive into this concept of radical self-acceptance. We kind of had a little bit of a pre-conversation about this, and I know I'm interested in just the topic in general. I can't wait to see where you take it. Obviously, therapy is not my background at all, so hearing from you is going to, I know, help so many women today. So just let's start off with something basic, right? We'll talk from a definitive perspective. What is radical self-acceptance?
Yeah, so I quite selfishly chose this to talk about because I feel like it's where I'm at personally right now. I've been thinking a lot about this concept. So I'm going to start with just a general definition of radical acceptance, and then kind of go into the self piece that I've been thinking through a lot lately. So in the mental health world in general, this idea of radical acceptance is the ability to accept things outside of our control, to not judge these things, and thus to reduce our suffering. So radical acceptance comes from this idea that suffering doesn't necessarily come directly from pain, but from our attachment to the pain. So if we were to define pain simply as a feeling of hurt, bother, trouble, or even on like a higher level, agony or distress, suffering would be defined more as this longer state of experiencing that pain. So the definition that I mentioned earlier could also read something like: suffering doesn't happen because of a painful experience, but because of the way we relate to that painful experience or fasten ourselves onto that painful experience. So with this idea of suffering coming from our attachment to pain, some of those in the mental health field paved the way really well to incorporate this into their therapy. And Carl Rogers is one in particular who did. And focused in on the idea that acceptance of the things we can't control is the first step toward change. And for a lot of you listening, that might resonate with you depending on where you land with faith. It's very much like a central part of the Buddhist faith, or the Christian serenity prayer that some may know, like, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. I don't fully remember the rest, but that phrase, to accept the things I cannot change. And so just talking about radical acceptance in general, a lot of this is focused on things that are happening to us or situations in which we find ourselves. And I'm going to take like a pause and step outside that for a second, because the therapist in me wants to say, this works well with some things and some things not at all. For example, if anyone is ever being harmed mentally, physically, emotionally, radical acceptance of that reality is definitely not the route to go. But we're talking more about things that are not causing extreme harm to us, but maybe just like this distress or pain or frustration, and being able to just accept those things and like move through them so that we're not suffering. There's a few arms of therapy that have come out of this, in particular dialectic behavior therapy, which is like a form of the more commonly known cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and this DBT. And then there's acceptance and commitment therapy, just throwing those out there. Lots of organizations or support groups will use this idea of acceptance. That's one of the tenets of AA. So it's kind of like becoming more entrenched in our culture, I think, thanks to the path that's been paved in mental health. So I feel like I'm talking for a long time. Interrupt me if you need to.
No, please go for it.
Going into the radical self-acceptance piece, I think that, let me think about this for a second. So I think all of these concepts of acceptance work well when we consider that things happen to us. I feel like our culture is okay with saying bad things happen to everyone, but I feel like our culture very sneakily doesn't so readily jive with the idea of radical self-acceptance, or in other words, like less than ideal things exist within each one of us. Like, I feel like when we start to recognize, oh, less than ideal things, we can go into this optimize mode, like fix, like change, like that behavior doesn't feel right to me, we're going to change it. And sure, there are times and places where that is definitely appropriate. But I think what that can do often is lead to this place where we are thinking more and more about avoiding discomfort, avoiding uncomfortable things about ourselves, or even if you're a parent, our children, instead of like this ability to move slowly, accept what's currently happening. And then if we need to make goals surrounding the things that we can control and change, let's do that. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I actually was just getting ready to say, so I have a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old, and hearing you talk about this, it's interesting because there is no, in my opinion, there's no self-awareness quite like the self-awareness that a parent receives when they have children, because your children emulate who you are. So if you were, for me, I know, I've been into personal growth and self-awareness for a dozen years or so, and it's become part of who I am and what I enjoy about, life. But at the same time, it's funny because when you have a 4 or 5-year-old that's like mimicking every little thing you do, you start to realize like, oh, I do that, or things that you say. I have a group right now on Facebook that I'm leading, and it's called Creating Healthy Kids. And it's just a free group. I can link it up in the show notes, but it's basically just a way for me to help parents instill healthy habits with their kids. So the conversation that came up yesterday was about diet culture and raising girls, especially in an era of diet culture and what that looks like. And, yesterday I was sharing that a variety of things that my family does and the way that we talk about food and all that. But one of the things that came up was, women who were realizing the way they were talking to themselves, whether it was out loud or internally, and how that was being received by their children or being emulated by their children. And so I think that's a good example of kind of what you're saying, right? Like, and also just wanted to point out that sometimes our kids are our best teachers. But it's also interesting because this brings about another thought in my mind too. I just saw this, I think it's a Tony Robbins quote. I don't know that for sure, but I think he shared it last week. And it's something to the degree of like, seek peace, not happiness, and you'll be the happiest you'll ever be all the days of your life. And I think that's such a beautiful concept. I think so many people are out there seeking happiness, and in reality, it's peace we're after, right? Like if we can have that sort of self-acceptance, not just for ourselves, but just for our circumstances, of course, like you said, like not in abusive situations, but just in general, like how much happier we can be. That's something that yoga has taught me. You mentioned the Buddhist faith and whatnot, but when I first started yoga, and by the way, anybody listening, I don't necessarily see a yoga practice as necessarily being a religious practice. For me, it's about movement. It's about connecting my mind and body and my spirit. And it's just, when you start a yoga practice and you start just an hour-long class, or you're doing it on your own or whatever, and you start that with this, setting your intention. At least that's how I've always done it, right? Is like you start the class with setting your intention. And even that can translate into life. Like, how can you start each day with intention, right? And then the class itself usually surrounds this concept of peace, finding peace within yourself, finding peace in your environment. So those are just some thoughts that came to my mind, but I'd love to know, this is the topic that you wanted to talk about today. So what is it that brought you to radical self-acceptance, or what's your journey like with this?
Yeah. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Enneagram. It's like one of those personality tests. It's my favorite, and we could do a whole episode about why, but I'll just state this. And for those of you who aren't familiar, maybe you can look it up, but I am a 9 with a 1 wing, which means I definitely want peace in my life. Like whenever there's not peace and there's disagreement or disrest between individuals, I want to like bring it back to equilibrium. But I have this 1 wing side of me, which is more like the perfectionistic tendencies, wants to do things right, which can serve us really, really well if channeled in the right direction and in a healthy place. But I find that often if something comes up like in my life where I'm like, gosh, wish I would have handled that differently. Or, I mean, parenting is always the example I'm going back to of like, gosh, that didn't feel right, didn't like that interaction, need to circle back around with that kiddo, like rediscuss this. Like I often, especially as an early parent, would go to this place of extreme self-criticism to the point where I was just beating myself up about like everything and having these outrageous expectations for myself, which part of that I think is my personality. Part of it I think is our culture. So as a marriage, I'll take a little tangent here. As a marriage and family therapist, I think we should be called systems therapists, because people hear the word marriage and family and they think, oh, you're a couples counselor. Yes, sometimes, but that's definitely not all. We are trained to look at all the systems that a person who comes into our office is a part of. So we never are looking at just the individual to assess a problem and help them set goals surrounding it and work through it. We are looking at the individual who's a part of many systems. So who is a part of a family of origin, a part of, if they're married and have their own family or have a partner, part of a different system there. If they're working, there's a system there. If you're living in a community, those systems can all look a lot different. Our culture at large, like all of these bigger systems that we're a part of, that we do not operate in a vacuum, so we can't treat problems or hangups as such. Like we have to consider all the systems. So all that to say, definitely part of it is my personality, but I think part of it is the culture that we're raised in, where there are these high expectations that are put upon us as moms, and we start to, you want to factor in social media and comparison, like we start to put these high expectations on ourselves and not give ourselves a moment to just like sit with the fact that we are growing, learning humans who are on a journey ourselves too, and trying to raise little ones. And it's unrealistic to try to figure it all out before you go in, because like you said, our kids are our best teachers. So some of the best learning we're going to do is in that like family dynamic. So for myself, my own journey with radical self-acceptance is that I think I just started to, like, as we grow and our minds and brains develop, I think we start to like put things into categories pretty naturally and start to view the world as like pretty black and white. And then as we get older, we start to realize, oh, there are things that don't fit into these categories that I've created. There are people who operate differently and who express themselves in different ways. And that doesn't necessarily fit with these systems that I've been a part of. And so as I started to go through life, really in probably the last 5 to 10 years, I think it's been the most growth for me in recognizing like, wow, I want to be able to accept people and learn from them for where they are, even if they're not like me. And I can't do that unless I'm looking at myself and having a radical self-acceptance for me, for my own being. Because I believe that our own radical self-acceptance can lead to radical acceptance of others around us. And I think that can lead us to the liberation of all people. If you want to go really, really big there and pull back, I think it's necessary. So it is a daily struggle. I have a love-hate relationship with my own radical self-acceptance. And some days I'm like, there you are. Thank you. It's good to see you. And then other days I'm like, why are you following me? Get away. I want to be hard on myself right now. I want to be a perfectionist. The last thing I want to do is accept where I am because today felt like an ick day and I wanted to do it differently. But it's where it is, it's reality. And if I want to stay mindful and in the present moment, I better be ready to accept the good and the bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, what a powerful thought. I mean, I think that was kind of a mic drop moment. It's hard to follow that up with another question, but I think you're so right. And you're so onto something, that sometimes it's interesting because it's when I think about this in terms of health and fitness, right? When someone comes to me and they want to transform their life and they want to transform their health, they come to me and they don't realize that it's a lot of simple steps in the right direction to get them, healthier. Same thing goes for your mental health, right? Like understanding your relationships with other people, understanding your relationship with yourself. Last week we had a podcast episode that I can link up in the show notes with my life coach, Amy Snow. And she talks about how John Maxwell, her mentor, talks about how the hardest form of leadership is self-leadership. Like, right. And the same thing goes for, I think you could say the same thing is true of self-acceptance, right? Or of acceptance in general. Like the most important form of acceptance is self-acceptance. Like, how can you accept others if you aren't accepting of yourself? It also makes me think of, I know for me, some of the most powerful personal growth books or subject matter that has made most of an impact for me is not just the stuff that's focused on me and how I can get better, but how it's focused on other people and how I can improve the relationships with other people. For example, the 5 love languages, right? I mean, that's a book that is so simple in as far as from an idea perspective. Or there's a book called Personalities Plus by Florence Littauer, right? So both of those books come to my mind as being some of the most impactful books for me. With 5 love languages, it helped me understand not only like what my husband's love language is and how he feels most loved and how I can now perform that. For him, it's physical touch and quality time. So how can I dedicate some of my energy towards spending time with him and sitting closer to him? Like those are things that matter to him. I'm also learning the love languages of my children, right? Which are different for each of them. And so it's been huge, and it's such a simple concept book, but it's made such a radical difference in my life. And then with Personalities Plus, I lead a team of health coaches. And so when it comes to mentoring people, or even just in friendships in general, family relationships, it's an old school book, but it's really, you take a quiz and it helps you identify. It's very similar to like Enneagram or the DISC profile, but kind of an old school version. Helps you kind of figure out like, how do I best interact with someone who's more of a socialite? How do I best interact with somebody who's more of an introvert? Like, what are the different ways that I can then serve them? And it's not about me, right? It's not always about me. So how can I make those relationships better? So that's awesome. I want to kind of take this into, how we can use this for our own improvement. How can we turn this into something that is tangible, that we can really act on to improve for ourselves? So my first question for you is, why is it necessary that we embrace self-acceptance? in order to build our best life. But also, can you tell us what that looks like? Like, what are some tangible things that we can maybe incorporate?
Yeah, I think that our lives move so fast. I think for me, as I get older, I feel like it's moving faster and faster every day. And I know there are some theories surrounding like it actually is speeding up, and I don't know a lot about that, but it just feels like time slips away and we fall into the rat race of do more, achieve more, experience more, on and on and on and on. And like, I think it's beautiful to hear you talk about these things that have been helpful for you in establishing strong relationships with your husband and your children. And I think it's great that you can take that info in and it be life-giving for you. I think that sometimes we have to watch that we're not making another checklist, of things to do. And I think sometimes it is like this slowing down. And if we believe that our kids are our best teachers, and if we believe that others around us are not just around us by accident, and if we believe that as a human species, we are way more interconnected than we could even imagine. Like, I think we are so much more interconnected that our minds would be blown if like the curtain was pulled back and we could see the big picture. Then it really requires that we are not only thinking about what we can do next, but how are we being in a moment? Like in a moment with myself, how am I embracing the moment? How am I at peace, like you said, because really what we're striving for is peace in a moment versus happiness. When I'm in a moment with someone else, how am I hearing from them? What are they teaching me? And it may not be an immediate, oh, I got that, and now I'm going to take it and do a step. I think sometimes it's more of a sit with it, let it like resonate, circle back around. Brad, my husband, and I were just talking about this the other night, about the idea of growth, and how I think a lot of times we can view growth as like a ladder, right? Like, okay, got that, check, done. Another one, got that, check, done. And I tend to view it more circular, but like three-dimensional. So like a spiral maybe, where like I think we circle around a lot of the same issues in our lives over and over. Like one of my common themes that I feel like I come back to often is in variety of situations with my kids, with my spouse, with my friends, in school, in my profession, is I'm not enough. So I think I circle that theme a lot, like I'm not enough, but I think that there's a depth to it each time I circle it, that like I'm seeing that in a different way. I'm learning from it. Sure, some things are changing, but how am I like relating to that message that I've been telling myself that I know isn't true, but it's still there and I can't just push it out. I got to have that radical self-acceptance to believe, hey, it's there. How am I interacting with it? What am I learning from it? How am I like, so I don't think growth is two-dimensional. I think that it's this three-dimensional like circling. I wish that we could like have a whiteboard and draw it, but does that kind of?
Yeah, I think you did a great job of describing it. I think, yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. And as you were speaking, it made me think, yeah, I can pick up on some themes that have been there for me too. Like whether it's been through business or through relationships or whatever, certain things that continue to pop up. So what do you think then, as it pertains to just society in general? If, you were mentioning earlier about this being both small scale, right? Like within ourselves, but then also bigger impact and how it could change the world. What does society need to be doing? I guess, how are we missing the mark on radical self-acceptance?
Yeah. It's a good question. I feel like we've been circling it a lot. So in a way, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, like we've talked about, to have it all figured out, especially around self. Like we need to know ourselves, right? Well, I think knowing ourselves in a moment can be true. Like I know myself right now, but we're shifting, changing, learning, growing people. So the person that I know right now may not be the person who I know in 10 years, 5 next week. Like there are things about
Right.
us, there are things we're experiencing in life we're living life wide open and taking things in and recognizing those around us as teachers to us as a part of our own journey, then we're constantly changing. So I think we should just throw it out. It's unrealistic to think that we have to like have everything figured out about ourselves at all. And I think that there is power. I think there's shame surrounding that initially. And I'm sure Brene Brown probably talks about this somewhere because she is the shame goddess expert in our world. Just a plug for her right there. She has great stuff. She actually has I think it's on Netflix, a documentary of her latest book coming out March 31st. So she's like an intense researcher. I love her because she writes in this beautiful way, but like it's very research based. She has researched shame to the nth degree. And I think we have a lot of shame surrounding admitting that we don't know, like we're supposed to have this figured out. I'm an adult. I'm this old. I should have it figured out. Because our society puts such a high value on knowing yourself uber well and not being able to say, well, yeah, I know myself now, but that could change, right? I also think as a society, we're missing the mark in that we tend to weed out and ostracize those who are really, really good at self-acceptance. I think some of our most amazing leaders in this area are those who are causing the most controversy in simply existing and living their lives boldly and beautifully and unashamed. The message of our culture is fit in, blend, don't stand out, don't be too different. And I was having a conversation about this the other day too, where it makes sense, right? I feel like we have this herd mentality. We as humans thrive on connection. We flourish when we feel known and we find others who have shared experience or things in common. And then we tend to diminish and decline when we're in isolation or around, maybe, constantly around everything that's new and not the same. So we tend to find like there's so much language around it in our culture. We find our people, our tribe, our team, our squad, and we stick with them. And typically these groupings are based on some sort of similarity. So the similarity that drew us together begins to naturally have a higher value in our eyes. And I'll use a silly example. I have a dear friend, we run together regularly. And really between our kids and running, that was what started our friendship. And now I have this amazing friendship with her. So it'd be really easy, like, right? It's centered around running. We love running. We joke about running and how much we like feel the adrenaline and like, oh, everything looks brighter and more beautiful today. It would be really easy. This is a silly example again, but it would be easy for us to be like, oh, those weightlifters. They don't, oh my gosh, what are they even doing? How do you even gain energy? And like ostracize, right? And weed out because it's different. And how could you not experience like the best high from running? And I think that we're doing that on way bigger levels, systemically and politically. And and so I think we need to accept that it's okay that we center around commonality and that we come together around that, but to not let it then become like those things that we have in common as more valuable than others. Because I think what that does is it creates this fear of what's different, right? And then we encounter someone out on the street who's so different than us. And it makes us feel uncomfortable and it makes us feel scared. And I think some of those people who are living their lives so boldly, beautifully, unashamed with who they are and trying to express themselves in these ways are some of our greatest teachers, and that we're really missing the mark. I could give more examples, but I don't know where you want to take it right now.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of that. There's a statement or a question that I've heard repeatedly that says, do you love yourself when you're by yourself? And I think you're right when it comes to how easy we are to ostracize others who are different than we are. And earlier you said, that you like to seek out relationships even if their people are different from you, right? And the same thing for me, and this is an interesting example, but both of my children are biracial. And when my husband and I decided we were going to go through adoption and that was going to be part of our story, we did all these several hours of education surrounding what it would be like to adopt transracially. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again, that it's been one of our greatest teachers as far as, I'll never forget somebody telling us, probably the number one piece of advice we ever got was someone telling us, make sure that you and your husband are putting yourselves in the room where you are the minority. And so, making that intentional effort for ourselves to do that and to get to know people that we otherwise would have never probably sat next to, right? Or would have never otherwise started a conversation with. But it all does come back to this idea of how, I don't want to say confident, but how at peace are you, I guess is the best phrase. Like, how at peace are you with yourself that you can then be open to experiencing like the peace of other people. And I think you're right that there is more that connects us than divides us, but we're so quick to be like, I'm the same way, I'm the opposite. I'm in the strength training. I'm not a runner. So I can easily say, oh, like who would ever want to run? And I say it to be funny a lot of times, like I have a sarcastic personality. Yes. But it's true though, right? And I think in our society, especially, I see it almost just exploding since the pandemic started. If you're on social media at all, you know what I mean? Like whether it's from a political perspective or whatever with the pandemic, regardless of where you stand, everybody has an opinion. And this, everybody is so quick to just this cancel culture idea, right? Like, oh, if you don't agree with me, then I just block me, or I'll block you and keep you out of my life. And it's like, well, how is that serving us? And how is that, and then yet we're the first people to see right now what's going on with Ukraine and Russia. And we're like, oh, we just want peace. But here we are at home saying, well, you're not allowed to be my friend and step into my space if you don't agree with me. Right. Mm-hmm. And it's like, what a dichotomy there, right? Like that's such a huge, it starts small. It goes back to this concept we've been talking about, right? It's everywhere from small to large. So the other thing that I wanted to say, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of just rambling with my stream of consciousness, but I think coming back again to children being our greatest teachers, I think about the questions that I ask my daughter at the end of a long day, right? Like we have conversations at the dinner table, and a lot of times it'll be in the bathtub. When she's in the bath, she likes to get really chatty when she's in the bathtub. So I ask her questions about her day and her little friendships that she has at preschool. And sometimes when I'm asking her the questions that I ask her, I realize, am I asking myself these questions? Right? Like, am I like, I'll say to her, and I wrote this down while you were talking, I'll ask her, like, well, what was your favorite thing about today? What was your least favorite thing about today? Mm-hmm. And I'll ask her the question, this has been a new one lately. I'll say, well, who challenged you today? Who gave you a challenge? And then when she answers me, I say, why? Like, why did that challenge you? And usually it comes down to the person, obviously, we're all different. So the person thinks differently than she does. Mm-hmm. Or is different than she is. And so for me to ask her that question of like, who challenged you and why did you feel challenged? Yeah. I think helps her realize like, oh, like the reason is because of our differences, but how can we bring it back to, well, what do you have in common, right? Like, were you both tired when you had that negotiation? Were you both hungry when you had, like things like that? And so, I mean, yeah.
And grown women, right?
And it goes for 5-year-olds and grown women. Absolutely. So the questions that I wrote down that I know that I ask her and that I need to start asking myself is, what or who challenged you today? Why? Digging deeper into that question of why. And sometimes you have to ask why multiple times to get to the root of that. When did I talk too much today and not listen enough? I ask her that. And I ask myself that. I started a process a couple of years ago of journaling. And I started out with just gratitude journaling. So every night, I'm not a morning person, so I have to do everything at night. So at nighttime, I would sit down with my journal at my nightstand and I would just write down quickly 3 things I was grateful for. And recently I've started adding to that a couple of questions of, Brendan Burchard talks about who needs me on my A game today. And so I'll ask myself the question, like, did I serve who needed me today on my A game? When did I talk too much today? And when should I have listened more? And did I do what mattered most to me today? So in other words, like sometimes I can really beat myself up, like, like when, especially as a business person, like I'm very driven for what I do. And I mean, I can work in what I work in all day long. Like I love what I do. And I have to make intentional efforts when it comes to relationships with my parents, relationships with my kids, because I can do this all day long. And
Yeah.
so, sometimes I have to tell myself, like, thank goodness there's a couple of, they're called high performance planners that I started using instead of just a good old to-do list. I used to be, you kind of nailed me earlier when you said checklist. I'm a checklist type. So I used to just have a traditional planner and I would write down all the things I needed to do today. And it was very like task oriented. And I started using this different kind of planner, and I can link it in the show notes, where it asks me questions like, what are my 3 goals for this week? And who are the 3 most important people that I'm meeting with? And then each day I have to outline like who matters most today. And so for me, I don't work at all on Saturdays, Sundays, and Mondays. That's when my daughter's off of preschool. We do family time, we have soccer practice, we do all that kind of stuff. And so for me, I'm okay with working Tuesday through Friday because I know that those 3 days of the week are fully dedicated to my family. And so I am here to show up for my business during those days. But then on those other 3 days when I'm with my family, I'm there to show up for them too. Right. And so I don't want to digress too much, but I think journaling and being able to ask yourself these questions, just like you would ask your child, helping them navigate their relationships at a young age, helping yourself navigate relationships, and helping you understand where you're challenged. The other thing that I want to say is there's a children's book that we started reading. It was a recommendation from her preschool. It's called In My Feelings. I'm not sure if you've seen it or not, but it's really cool. But it's got like a heart shape on the cover, and then each page identifies a color that the child is feeling. So when I'm happy, I feel yellow like the sun. When I'm red, I feel this or whatever. And so it goes through that. And I think, it's interesting because Ellery and I can have a conversation for an hour about how she's feeling, and we can go through those pages and talk about like, well, what does that make you feel like? And she'll say physically what it makes her feel like. My stomach starts to tumble, or my cheeks get red, she'll tell me. So she starts to have these, like, it's like a physical awareness surrounding her emotional awareness.
Yeah.
And so, even if you're 38 like me and you're listening to this podcast, check out In My Feelings, which is a children's book. It can go a long way to help you understand, what you're up against. I think a lot of times we just internalize it as stress. It's just like, because something's different or because it challenges us, we internalize it as stress. We don't deal with it. And I think Brene Brown is the person who says, sit in it, like just sit in it. Right. So anyways, before I go off on too much of a tangent, I just wanted to say those several things.
Love it. I hope that you will list your questions, because I'm like, I didn't write them down, and that's a great list of questions. Like you said, for kiddos and for ourselves to journal about. Those were amazing. I love the one about what challenged, or who challenged you the most, or what challenged you the most today, and how you were recognizing the theme of difference that was there, and then focusing back on commonalities. What you're doing, it's beautiful, because you're giving your daughter the ability to discover her own language for relationships with people. And I love like the idea of like, what is it that challenged me? What do we have in common? Let's strengthen that. And then if we could even take it a step further to say, what was it about that person's difference that could make me better, or could make me into my best version of myself? Because I think that's where, like, to circle back to what I said at the beginning, I think our own radical self-acceptance leads to radical self-acceptance of others and the liberation of all people. And I'd like to share a story here at the end to maybe close it up that relates to that. But before, I want to say that I also love that your daughter was like, physically, I feel boom, boom, boom. Because as kids, they can go there, right? And then as we grow and brush up against the world, we stop recognizing the somatic feeling, like the feelings within our body that are connected to our emotion. And the truth is, it's all connected. It's not separate. And I love how kids teach us that. Like, well, that feels like this pit in my tummy. Like, that's beautiful. Like, I think if we could teach our kids to maintain that throughout their lives instead of disconnecting from their bodies, that'd be amazing. So I think you're doing with her, which is amazing.
It'll be
Um,
interesting to see how sometimes I think to myself, like, well, we'll see how this gets translated and what I hear back from the preschool teacher. Sometimes,
yes.
like I'm waiting for her to be in a conflict at preschool and then like bring some sort of emotional awareness to this to the conflict of some kind, but she told me yesterday, this is just a side tangent before you tell us, she was telling me about she's 5.5, so she's on the older end of the spectrum for her preschool, and there are some kids that are just 3. So she was telling me yesterday how she looks out for this little boy who's 2.5 or 3, and how he sometimes has trouble understanding his feelings. And I thought to myself, it was almost like this little pride moment for myself, because I thought, at 5.5, for her to have that awareness that like I help him with his feelings, or I help him understand his feelings. I thought, yes, like, I might have had a very challenging day and she might have gone to her room like 7 times, but that moment was a good moment. So anyways, carry on. I'd love to hear your story.
Yeah, I just want to wrap up with this one story that has been really impactful for me. I listened to Glennon Doyle's podcast. I don't know if you listen to her at all, but I think it's called We Can Do Hard Things. But her podcast recently, she interviewed Alok, who is a non-binary individual, uses pronouns they, them. And Alok was talking about radical self-acceptance, right? And what that looks like, and how they had been growing up taught that they were to look a certain way, act a certain way, behave a certain way, and that it wasn't resonating for Alok. And so they took this different path. And now, like, it kind of circles back to that, what I said. I think some of our greatest teachers in this area of radical self-acceptance can make a lot of us feel super uncomfortable, right? To see someone journeying their life and figuring it out to that degree. And the thing that they shared was a story of their grandmother, who at one point something had happened, and the grandmother had said, "How could you do that to me?" And it was nothing done to the grandmother. I'm forgetting what it was that happened, but it was something that Alok had experienced. It had nothing to do with the grandmother, but it was very public and out there. And the grandmother was feeling, I think, shame surrounding it. And Alok, of course, was hurt by it and processed through that, but then said, I want to take it to this higher level thinking here. And I want to address what I think was going on internally with my grandmother. And what Alok thought was going on internally with their grandmother was that she had lived under this culture, Indian culture, that had said, your life looks like this. And I think Alok said, growing up, one of the things that was taught was that, like, of course, we're all going to be depressed, but we're just going to deal with it. Like, there was this unhappiness in the home that existed, but it was accepted as this is part of it. And Alok said that they like to think that what the grandmother was experiencing in that moment, and grandmother has since passed, so did not get to have this conversation with her, but what Alok thinks was happening was that grandmother felt the freedom that Alok was walking in was like, how are you allowed to do that? And I haven't been able to, even if she didn't have the words to verbalize it. How are you allowed to have this radical self-acceptance that I never could reach? And there's something about that that's hard, right? And if we then sit in grandmother's shoes, in this place of radical self-acceptance of what has happened to me up to this point in my life, and now I'm 80 some years old, and realizing there is more, and there are journeys that others are experiencing that are different than mine, and that's okay, that there might be a grieving process that happens surrounding our own radical self-acceptance of how we've chosen to live our lives or where we are at a certain point. And that's part of it too, like accepting that grief and then being able to like feel liberated because of where others are walking. And now I'm not saying then that we should all throw out and like everyone use they, them pronouns and get rid of the binary gender like completely. But whenever we see individuals walking that route and it makes us uncomfortable, I think we need to stop and say, like, what is it about that that's here to teach me and help me become the best version of myself? So that was a long story, but that's what I wanted to share there at the end.
And that is a perfect way to wrap up. I'm so grateful that you took time out of your day to day to share all this insight with us. As always, it starts with self-awareness, moves to self-acceptance, and then we can move on to accept the world. I want you to tell people, where can we find you and how can we get in touch with you if you want to?
Yeah, so I did a little podcast. I can't remember if we mentioned that or not. And it's available on Apple and a few other places, I think Stitcher, and I don't even remember where it is all right now because it was done in 2020 and I had so much fun with it. And it's called The Therapist in Training. And I'm still keeping that avenue open right now with school and internship and thesis writing. It's all kind of on the back burner, but at some point in time, I'd love to go back to that. Currently, that's really the only place. I'm on social media, but I have private accounts. So you could, but at some point, there will be a website where you can connect with me professionally. I'm just not quite there yet. So
yeah.
That's
totally cool. So what we'll do is I had the blessing of being on your podcast.
Email me. Anyone can email me at AmandaNicoleCallen@gmail.com.
Okay.
NICOLE.
Perfect. Okay. Well, we will link that up in the show notes, and then we will also link to your Therapist in Training podcast. Again, thank you so much for spending time with me today. I know we're both moms, so we're off to just, to be a mom next or whatever the case is. So thanks so much for being here. I know we'll talk again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jenny. Bye.